Hello there. Today I wanted to take a look at a Crozes-Hermitage from what is quite a good vintage. It's a wine that, according to everything I've read, should be well past its drinking date, but actually what I found was that the fruit seems to have held up really quite well. So the wine I'm looking at is Domaine du Murinais from Luc Tardy, and it's their Crozes-Hermitage Les Armandires. So Luc Tardy, with his wife Catherine, took over a family estate back in 1988. Luc had studied oenology, so he changed the focus of the farm. Although he's the seventh generation of his family to be growing grapes on the property, they had always sold them prior to this. So Luc stopped growing and selling apricots and shifted the farm's focus entirely to winemaking, making him the first member of his family to bottle and sell wines directly to consumers. His father had been selling grapes to the local cooperative, and evidently his grandfather had specialised in raising goats. This is a 40-hectare farm with a large, old, rambling farmhouse, underneath which there are some large vaulted cellars that date back to 1683, even before the start of the family's ownership of the property, which came in 1774. There was plenty of space for winemaking in these underground cellars, so when he took over the property, Luc was able to create a modern, gravity-fed winery with concrete fermenting vats. The name Les Armandires also has some significance for this change. It's a single plot, and the name refers to an almond plantation that was on the site where these vines are now planted. The property is 40 hectares, but even today there are only 22 hectares of vineyard. They only make Crozes-Hermitage. The majority of that is red. They have 2 hectares of plantings of the white grape varieties Marsanne and Roussanne, and that's in a proportion 2/3 of Marsanne to 1/3 of Roussanne, from which they make a small amount of white Crozes-Hermitage. The climate here is a Mediterranean climate, but essentially it's a continental climate that is then modified by the Mistral, the cooling north wind that they receive here. The vineyards are located around the property, and the property sits in the commune of Beaumont-Montaigu. This is in the southeast portion of the Crozes-Hermitage appellation. The vineyards are on clay limestone terraces, so these are alluvial soils with river gravel, and that includes large, what they call galets roulés, rolled glacial stones, and there is a high proportion of sand in the topsoil, but the underlying soils are predominantly clay and limestone. The vineyards are on a slight incline, and they're located 120 metres above sea level. And it tends to be with the plantings that it's those areas that have the most clay, which is where the white grape varieties are planted. In 2007, when this wine was made, they were practicing organic viticulture, with all the work in the vineyard being done in respect to nature. So the vines were cultivated without herbicides, without chemical fertilizers, and without any use of insecticides. The soils are ploughed during the winter. The vines are hilled, they're pruned, and then they hoe between the vines during the summer. Vine diseases are controlled by maintaining vigour and also by making sure there's good airflow through the canopy. So really the preventative measures are leaf and shoot thinning, just to give that airflow and aerate the bunches. They say phytosanitary treatments were only used when absolutely necessary, and even then they always prioritised natural treatments. So that relates to the 2007 vintage. However, since 2021, the domain's viticulture has been certified as Biodynamic. Now, the 2007 vintage for the Northern Rhone was exceptional, particularly for the reds. Now, the growing season began with a moderate winter and a warm early spring. This encouraged early flowering and an even bud burst. However, a cool and really quite dank summer really sort of put the dampeners on these sort of balmy conditions, and rot and mildew fast became a problem, along with a degree of dilution. September, however, when that arrived, brought warm, dry weather, dried out the grapes. It enabled them to regain their concentration. In most domains, picking had started by the end of the month. Everything at Domaine du Murinais is picked by hand. Yields, I believe, were about 42 hectolitres per hectare, and sorting went on both in the vineyard at picking, but also back at the winery on sorting tables before the fruit went into the vats. The wine is made 100% from Syrah, from relatively young vines. The plantings for this vineyard appear to have gone on in 1992 and 2002. The bunches were destemmed, and they say each terroir was processed separately. So I'm assuming Amandiers is what they mean by terroir. Well, it's possible they may be referring to individual plots within this vineyard. Traditional vinification went on. Fermentation went on in concrete tanks and lasted for 3 weeks. It's possible this may have been done with spontaneous fermentation. I don't have anything that definitely tells me that the 2007 was made in that way. However, spontaneous fermentations are what the domain aims for these days. During fermentation, they alternated daily between punching down the cap of skins back into the fermenting must or pumping it back over the skins. In all, the wine stayed with its skins for 25 days. The wine then aged in a combination of 2 to 4 year old demi-muid barrels, so large 600-litre barrels, and concrete vats. Aging went on for a period of 12 months, and during that period the wine wasn't racked at all. The wine was then bottled in the November of the following year. It wasn't fined, but a light filtration was done. Now, the notes I've seen suggest that this is a wine that should have been consumed by 2013, so I'm a little overdue there. And actually, this is a relatively simple wine. This is not the wine in the domain's range that's been aged in barriques or other small cooperage. It is, however, from the 2007 vintage, so a pretty good vintage. So let's see how it's got on. First thing I'd say is that the wine has a really good depth of colour. It's an almost sort of blackish purple hint, I'd say garnet. The wine has 13% alcohol and yet seems to be throwing some reasonable tears there. There's a decent structure to it, certainly. So let's see what we make of the aromas, shall we? Okay, the aromas are developed. They're very savoury. There's actually a really underlying meaty note. But then behind all that, there's a sort of a black fruit. There's almost a sort of a licoricey concentration. But then, if you look at it, there are hints of sort of damson or black plum, bullace. As the wine opens up, you can see there's still some fruit there. It's quite developed, but it's definitely present. So let's have a taste. On the palate, there's certainly a meatiness, but then there's also a depth and there's a smoothness. The other thing there is there's quite good acidity. I'm getting a bit of a mouth-watering sensation around the edges of my tongue, and there I'm able to see a little bit of black fruit. It's that sort of damson, bullace sort of note. It's followed up by sort of a touch of bitter licorice. It's really quite nice concentration, and then gives way to a little bit more sort of meatiness on the finish. There are perhaps some peppery hints there as well, but they're not particularly pronounced. Structure is smooth. There's sort of a slightly dusty sort of cocoa note, and the length is reasonably good. I'm sure this is a wine that would have shown a lot more red fruit and a more lively nature, against which it would have shown off some spices had I have consumed this 10 years ago or so. But actually, I think I've been lucky enough that this is a wine from a really good vintage with some nice acidity. And while I'm sure I'm drinking it past its optimum, there's actually still enough life in it for the wine to be enjoyable. I looked at the Wine Searcher aggregated critic score for this vintage of this wine, and it gets marked 88 out of 100, which is not bad for a not particularly expensive Crozes-Hermitage. Having said that, I wonder if the people who gave those marks might perhaps have upped them by 1 or 2 points, had they have known that this wine had the potential still to be providing enjoyable drinking when it was 18 years old. I'm by no means trying to convince you that this is in perfect condition. It would probably have been best drunk at least 4 or 5 years ago, but it is a wine that's managing to show some really good depth, and backed by its good acidity has actually managed to last quite well. And I don't think you'll find that's unusual for Crozes-Hermitage from small, high quality, family owned estates such as this. To my mind, this wine proves that these are wines that are very well priced and quite regularly over deliver. So thank you so much for joining me. I do hope you found the tasting of interest. If you have enjoyed the tasting, do please press the like button. That would be fantastic. If you would like to watch more of these videos, or if you're watching them and you haven't subscribed yet, do please consider signing up and subscribing. That would really help me to develop the channel further. If you have friends you think might like to watch this or any of the other videos, do please feel free to pass them on to them. And if you have any comments, it would be fantastic if you'd pop those in the comments box below. I'd love to know what you think about the wines I'm looking at, the tastings I'm doing, or anything else that relates to that. I'll, of course, pop pop a link in the notes below to the Wine Searcher webpage for this vintage of this wine, so you can see if it or other vintages of the same wine are available in your market and at what price they are. So thank you once again for joining me, and I do hope that maybe you'll manage to make some time and come and join me for another tasting in the very near future. Until then, bye for now.